The Wasp Factory. Chapter 6. The Scull Grounds. When Agnes Caldheim arrived, 8.5 months pregnant, on her BSA 500 with the swept-back handlebars and Eye of Sauron painted red on the petrol tank, my father, perhaps understandably, not ferociously pleased to see her. She had, after all, deserted him almost immediately after my birth, leaving him holding the squealing baby, to disappear without so much as a phone call or a postcard for 3 years, and then breeze back down the path from town and across the bridge. Rubber handlebars just clearing the sides and no more, carrying somebody else's baby or babies and expecting to be housed, fed, nursed, and delivered by my father was a little presumptuous. Being only 3 at the time, I can't remember much about it. In fact, I can't remember anything about it at all, just as I can't remember anything before the age of 3, but then, of course, I have my own good reason for that, from the little I've been able to piece together. When my father was chosen to let slip some information, when my father has chose to let slip some information, I've been able to get what I think is an accurate idea of what happened. Mrs. Clamp had come across with some details on sporadic occasions too, though they are probably no more to be relied on than what my father's told me. Eric was away at the time, staying with the Stoves in Belfast. Agnes, tanned, huge, all beads and bright caftan, determined to give birth in the lotus position, in which she claimed the child had been conceived, while going on, refused to answer any of my father's questions about where she had been for the last 3 years and who she'd been with. She told him not to be so possessive about her and her body. She was well and with child, and was all he needed to know. Agnes ensconced herself in what had been their bedroom, despite my father's protests. Whether he was secretly glad to have her back, or perhaps even had some foolish idea that she might be back to stay, I can't say. I don't think he is all that forceful really, despite the aura of brooding presence he can show when he wants to be impressive. I suspect that my mother's obviously determined nature would have been enough to master him. Anyway, she got her way and lived in fine style for a couple of weeks, that heady summer of love and peace, etc. My father still had full use of both his legs at the time, and had to use them to run up and down from the kitchen or lounge to the bedroom and back when Agnes rang the little bell's swoon into the bell-bottoms of her jeans, which lay draped over her chair by the side of the bed. On top of that, my father had to look for me. I was toddling around at the time, getting into mischief, the way normal, healthy 3-year-old boy does. As I say, I can't remember anything, but I'm told that I did seem to enjoy annoying old Saul, the bandy-legged and ancient white bulldog my father kept. I'm told because it was so ugly, and it didn't like women, it didn't like motorbikes either, and had gone wild when Agnes first arrived, barking and attacking. Agnes kicked it across the garden, and it ran off, yelping into the dunes, only reappearing once Agnes was safely out of the way. Confined to bed, Mrs. Clamp maintains that my father ought to have put the dog down years before all this happened, but I think the wet-jowled, yellow, bleary-eyed, fishy-smelling old hound must have worked on his sympathy just by being so repulsive. Agnes duly went into labor about lunchtime one hot, still day, pouring sweat and oming to herself, while my father boiled lots of water and things, and Mrs. Clamp dabbed Agnes's brow. And like as not to told and as and like as not to told her of the woman she'd known who had died in childbirth. I played outside, running around in a pair of shorts, and I imagined quite happy to have the whole pregnancy going on because it gave me more freedom to do as I liked about the house and garden, free from my father's supervision. What I ever did to annoy old Saul, whether it was heat that made him especially cantankerous, whether Agnes really had kicked him in the head when she arrived, as Mrs. Clamp says, none of this do I know, but the little tousle-headed, dirty, tanned, bold toddler that was me might well have been up to some sort of mischief involving the beast. It happened in the garden over a piece of ground that later became a vegetable patch when my father went on his health food binge. My mother was heaving and grunting, pushing and breathing, an hour or so away from producing, and attended by both Mrs. Clamp and my father, when all three, or at least two, I suppose Agnes might have been too preoccupied, heard frenzied barking and one high, awful scream. My father rushed to the window, looked out and down into the garden, then shouted and ran out of the room, leaving Mrs. Clamp goggle-eyed alone. He ran out into the garden and picked me up. He ran back to the house, shouted up at Mrs. Clamp, then put me on the table in the kitchen and used some towels to stop the bleeding as best he could. Mrs. Clamp, still ignoring and quite engaged, appeared still ignorant and quite enraged, appeared with the medicine he had demanded, then almost fainted when she saw the mess between my legs. My father took the bag from her and told her to get back upstairs to my mother. 1 hour later, I had recovered consciousness, was lying drugged and bloodless on my bed. My father had gone out with the shotgun he owned, then to look for old Saul. He found him in a couple of minutes before he had properly left the house. The old dog was cowering by the door of the cellar, down the steps in the cool shadow. He whined and shivered, and my young blood mixed on his slavering chops with gamey saliva and thick-eyed mucus as he grinned and looked shakily and pleadingly up at my father, who picked him up and strangled him. Now, I did eventually get my father to tell me this, and according to him, it was just as he choked the last struggling life out of the dog that he heard another scream, this time from above, inside the house, and that was the boy they called Paul being born. What sort of twisted thoughts went through my father's brain at the time to make him choose such a name for the child, I cannot start to imagine, but that was the name Agnes chose for his new son. He had to choose it by himself because... that was the name Agnes chose for his new son. He had to choose it by himself because Agnes didn't stay long. She spent 2 days recovering, expressed shock and horror at what had happened to me, then got on her bike and roared off. My father tried to stop her by standing in her way, so she ran him over and broke his leg quite badly on the path before the bridge. Thus, it was Mrs. Clamp found herself looking after my father while he insisted on looking after me. He still refused to let the old woman call in any other doctor and set his own leg, though not quite perfectly, hence the limp. Mrs. Clamp had to take the newly born child into the local cottage hospital, the day after Paul's mother left. My father protested, but as Mrs. Clamp pointed out, it was quite enough to have to look after two individuals in the same house without having an infant needing constant care as well.